we're going to narrow things down a little bit, not just all of Mexico. We're going to talk about Naica and more than the Cave of the Crystals, although what more than the Cave of the Crystals you could want, I'm not sure anybody would know. As always, when I talk about Mexico, I like to dedicate my talks to my good friend, Dr. Romero, who built a fabulous collection, which now strangely resides in Beirut. And thank, of course, a whole bunch of people, especially Mary, for organizing Mineral Nexus and these talks. Jeff Scoville, Joe Budd, Gonzalo Infante for photographs, and various people whose pictures I've stolen off the internet. Thank you very much. And then a bunch of people who've been responsible over the years for work I've done in Mexico, Naica, and of course, Lauren and Allison for putting up with me for all these years. So a little safe harbor statement here to begin with. I'm a geologist, so I sometimes get a little technical, and when I give talks, I like to give you a little bit of technical geologic context and then get into some of the prettier pictures. So bear with me on that stuff. There's a range of knowledge bases in the room, so there should be something here for everyone. So let's start with the Mexican Carbonate Replacement Deposit Belt. That's what CRD stands for. Mexico, just geologically, what matters for the carbonate replacements is the carbonate rocks, the limestones in eastern Mexico, which were folded and smashed the last time Europe smashed into North America about 65 million years ago, creating the laramide orogeny and what's called the Mexican Fold Thrust Belt. And then over here in orange or terracotta, you have the Sierra Madre Occidental, which is one of the world's largest ignimbrite fields. So this is rhyolite volcanism, so very silicic, think granite composition, but Yellowstone type, 1,000 cubic kilometers of stuff erupted instantaneously, kind of eruptions. One of these after another went off. And it's an interplay between intrusions related to that and these folded and structurally prepared carbonate rocks, which localize the deposits. So the big CRDs of Mexico are shown in red, smaller ones are shown in green. I'm an exploration geologist. You do not have to be a geologist to understand where you explore. You follow the belt of the big deposits, and they exist they're dominantly developed on the west side of the Fold Thrust Belt, where it's closest to the intrusion. So you have deep penetrating structure, intrusions came up, found a big thick section of structurally prepared carbonate rocks, and boom, you have a bunch of big deposits. And we recognize a certain spacing between these deposits, and recognizing that there was a gap here, that there was something missing, we discovered what is probably the largest CRD in Mexico, completely blind, right about in that area. The black dots are weird vein deposits that are related to carbonate replacement deposits. So they're what you could think of them as CRD processed and placed in the wrong environment. So unreactive rocks. Just to understand a little more about the geologic environment, when these deposits were forming, Baja hadn't decided it would rather be in San Diego or San Francisco and started moving yet. So you slide it back to where it was prior to about 7 million years ago, and you had continuous subduction along the western coast of Mexico, and you have these belts of these major silver deposits. Mexico has produced 25% of all the silver mined in human history. Not only that, but if you look around the world, there's 15 districts that have produced over 1 billion ounces of silver. 8 of them are in Mexico. So it's where you want to be for silver, period, and it's where you want to be for big silver. And this is, of course, related to subduction of oceanic plate, intercontinental material, all kinds of melting and cool things, and then you have differentiation and assimilation, and these intrusions wind up in shallow levels in the crust, and that's what makes the ore deposits. So looking at carbonate replacement deposits specifically, you have one of the tops of one of those intrusions coming up here. It's emplaced in a section of carbonate shown in blue, and around the intrusion, it throws off a bunch of dikes, but around the intrusion you develop skarns, and then distal to those skarns you get mantos and chimneys, and then when you get into those unreactive rocks, things become veins. So those deposits I was talking about are veins like this, which if you had the budget and the imagination, you would drill for the carbonate rocks underneath. Looking for this sort of thing. It might be, 1,000, 2,000 meters down there, so it might take you a while to get there. But basically, this is the model we use in a general sense to explore for these deposits, and Naica is a textbook example of. As collectors, for all kinds of interesting reasons, you're all very familiar with these deposits because, among other things, the reactions result in a reduction of volume. So you wind up, they make their own open space during the time of mineralization. So there's big holes for the big crystals to grow in. So you've heard of places like Bisbee, Tiger, Leadville, Tintic, the Glove, the Defiance, Setiolalia, Ojuela, Naica, Concepcion del Oro, all these ones in South America, Uchuchaqua, Ica, Pachapaque, and then in Europe you have Lavrion, Dalmagorsk, Yaoganshan, Wangang. So these are deposits that occur all over the world. Actually, once you start looking at them in detail, you recognize that a lot of the minerals have very similar morphology from one of these deposits to the other, and I'll argue that actually the morphology of the specimens gives you an indication of what kind of system you're in. So Naica sits right here in the center of the state of Chihuahua. Right there, it is at the end of the road. Here is the town of Naica. There is the road coming in from two different directions. There's nowhere else to go because this is a military reservation that surrounds it. So there's about 2 kilometers square of private property completely surrounded by the military reservation. The military reservation could not exist without the water that's pumped from the mine. So there's sort of this back and forth, a contentious relationship between the two. But as I'll show you in a minute, the district consists of the Sierra de Naica, the Sierra Monarca, and the Sierra en Medio, which is a clever name, which means the mountain in the middle. And so here's a map of that. Here's the Sierra de Naica, Sierra en Medio, Sierra Monarca out here. That area of private property basically sits right here. And that's where the mining activity has been since the early 1700s. So Naica is a really interesting system in the sense that it's not just one chimney, it's 88 chimneys. So think of 88 octopuses swimming with their heads going down, and one tentacle of one octopus made it to the surface. So that was the discovery, and it took 150 years to go after some of the little stuff around it, the bleeders that came off of it, to come down and recognize that this was a 50 million ton high-grade ore deposit. That's the discovery outcrop. So basically that entire system was found from this little hole. It expands a little bit, but it's less than 80 meters across in both directions. But that mineralization came up, and on the side of the mountain, we see this shale, remnants of this shale sitting underneath a younger limestone unit. That shale used to extend out over the surface that's now been eroded, and the mineralization came up and it sort of blossomed out underneath that seal. So think of this, the ribs of an umbrella or a tree that's been turned upside down, and the old timers found these little zones oxidized, followed them back to the chimney, and then followed the chimney to depth. So back in the old days, this district had lots of different claims going several kilometers away from it. There were a number of companies that ran on it. Ultimately, it was discovered that the Gibraltar claim was where the top of that manto came to the surface, but it actually goes down and then wiggles out of the Gibraltar claim fairly quickly. So early mining was very primitive, all done by hand. It could only be done in the rainy season because there's no water out here at all. And so they would come out, the small scale miners would take this stuff to Chihuahua, where they would sell it to the smelter and get paid for the silver. And of course, the smelter didn't bother to tell them about the fact that it actually was fairly high in gold. So smelter just kept gold. This is the way people pulled ore out, these tump lines on their foreheads. Bring it out, dump it in the bin, and go from there. Up until, that's the way things were pretty much until the 1910, 1911, when the Mexican Revolution kicked in. Naica got shut down because Pancho and his guys made it impossible to work out there. So it got shut down for a number of years and then sort of came back into activity after the revolution. And they finally brought a train line in so they didn't have to bring their water in on burros or wait for the rainy season. So they brought this nice train in about 30 kilometers from the river where they could get lots of water. And for those who love railroads, this is what their engine looked like. That's this same engine. This was pretty coming out of the factory. That was after it had been working for a while. So here's what the hillside looks like. That discovery outcrop is up here. This was the principal shaft. That was the Gibraltar shaft. They still use it, but it's now been deepened to about 1,000 meters. And then this is the principal Toledo adit, which goes into the side of the mountain. This is the zero level from which everything is counted. So that discovery outcrop's about plus 200 meters, and then the rest of the mine goes down to about 1,100 meters depth. So Naica doesn't have a lot of oxidized mineral specimens like you see in the market from Santa Eulalia or Ojuela or most of our other favorite Mexican localities, because of this business of most of the surface stuff being very shallow, mined out a long time ago, and there was no real large-scale oxide production prior to 1920, and then after that, not much was saved. This is the kind of thing that you actually do see every once in a while. That's a lovely wolfenite and mimetite specimen that came out of the Harvard Museum. What you do see every once in a while is these beautiful little linerites in gypsum. These are typically micros. A batch of this stuff came out sometime in the late 60s, shortly before they closed off all of these underground, all of these shallow level workings. So the oxide zone only extended to about 180 meters below the tunnel level. And you can see there really wasn't much of an ore body above that. Things really got interesting once you got down to the water table. And one of the first things they recognized when they brought the shaft down and began to go after these sulfide bodies is all these oxide workings coming off to the side were sucking up a bunch of the ventilation. So they were ventilating useless dead space. So and they also had ore thieves coming in through those old workings. So they sealed them off with anywhere from 5 to 25 meters of concrete. So not only is there no access to the old workings, but all those names associated with the old workings, Lepanto, Siglo XX, Monarca, Maravillas, all these names that you see on old labels, almost always incorrectly attributed to the mineral specimen, became meaningless by the late 50s. So really, what we should call all of these and what the mine calls itself is Mina Naica. So your label should say Mina Naica, Municipio of Saltillo, Chihuahua, Mexico. Gibraltar, all that other stuff, forget it, because those names were long abandoned. So as you come into Naica, this is the road into town. Mining is obviously a big deal. It is essentially the only industry in town, with the exception of a little tourism related to witches, which I'll explain in a minute. Similar view to what we saw before. This is the plant and office buildings before the mine shut down. Big mural with heroic miners holding out for keeping the mine working. Again, that discovery outcrop is right up here on the side of the hill. So one of the aspects of Naica that has been an issue since the very beginning is water. Naica produces a lot of hot water. So even back into the 1920s, they were making 1,000 gallons a minute of water that was 35 degrees Celsius. You can tolerate that. That's 95 degrees Fahrenheit. But as things advanced and they got a little deeper, that went up to 2,500 gallons a minute. Temperature went up to 45. increase gradually. So by the time you're down on the 1,000-meter level, you're making 22,000 gallons of water a minute at 54 degrees C. That's hot. You can work about 20 minutes at the face. You have to sit in a cooling shed for 20 minutes, and then the shifts go back and forth. In 2015, they hit too much water to handle and the mine closed, and I'll talk about why that probably happened. But as the mine geologist, my friend Roberto Villasuso, said in 2006, they were mining 40 tons of water for every ton of ore. Now you start thinking about the energy it takes to lift 40 tons of water 1,000 meters. That's as expensive or more expensive than hoisting ore. So your ore better be pretty high grade to cover that. And unfortunately, it wasn't for a lot of that time. So the overall district production in the oxide period, best estimates are about 2 million tons at 400 grams silver and 16% lead. Didn't get paid for the gold, but it was probably in the 3 to 5 gram per ton range. And then during the sulfide era, and I don't know what happened to the S, they produced almost 40 million tons, half a gram of gold, 141 grams of silver, 7% combined lead and zinc. And as you got deeper, copper started to come in and things like that. So quite a switch from this kind of mining to modern mining. That's a lot of the reason the grade went down, because this style of mining involves a lot of dilution. Again, there's the discovery outcrop and a bunch of other little surface peckings. Now, these surface peckings dot the mountain, and a legend has grown up in Naica about the witches, Las Brujas de Naica. And so you go on the internet and you Google the Brujas de Naica, and these witches are all believed to live in the old mine workings. At 11 o'clock at night, they emerge from the mine as fireballs that skirt around the town looking for children who are out past their bedtime. And little girls are grabbed and spirited off to become witches, and little boys are spirited off to become dinner, probably. Anyway, it's this elaborate thing, and they talk about this. There's a wonderful story of this young woman who was entranced by a full moon coming off the reflecting off this lake, and that she was so enraptured by this that she stayed up too late, and she was caught by the witches and disappeared, and the only thing they found was a flower that she always wore, a camellia in her hair, and that was by the side of the lake. You get the idea. This is a really old legend, right? There hasn't been a lake there. There wasn't a lake there before the mid-1960s. So this is all very recent, and a lot has been made of it for the tourism. But if you go on this, there's all kinds of cool, nasty little videos on the internet about this. For those of you who knew him, that's John Whitmire, a very famous mineral dealer collector with one of his Mexican compatriots down there. John brought a lot of stuff out of Naica back in the 60s and 70s, as did Benny Fenn, who's legendary for San Pedro Corralitos mimetite. Benny ran this little convenience store and insisted on gassing up our car for us. He wouldn't. Is
that guy with John? Is that Ruben?
It might be. So, moving into geology a little bit, here is a face in the mine. So this is massive limestone. This is massive skarn and sulfide replacement. The shape of this tells you that the fluids were moving in this direction and reacting with the limestone, and that's how the replacement process advances. So another way to look at this, here's an intrusion. It kicks off ore fluids. Those move some distance until they encounter carbonate, shown here in blue, and they gradually dissolve the carbonate and reprecipitate the sulfide. So what you have is a coupled dissolution and precipitation mechanism. So you have an acid, hot, saline fluid loaded with metals. It hits the limestone, which is effectively an infant buffer. So it's like when you drip vinegar into baking soda when you were a kid, that the vinegar neutralizes the acid. The acid can no longer carry the metals, so it dumps them out in those nanovoids that are created as the carbonate is deposited, and that's how the carbonate is dissolved. So that's how replacement occurs, gradually eating its way through the rock. I say gradually because at Santa Eulalia we've calculated that the mantos grew 6 kilometer manto grew in about 100,000 years. So these things are really ripping when you think about it. So that process of replacement, because of the skarn silicate and sulfide mineral atomic structure is more compact than carbonate, you get about a 15 to 20% volume reduction. And at a certain point, those sulfides and silicates are just too weak to hold up their weight. So they collapse and they create these columns of breccias, these beautiful breccia chimneys. And then mineralization is still going on. So you've got all these voids that have developed into which your beautiful big sulfides and other things can grow. So here's multiple stages of that growth, with the principal fluid direction being upwards, gradual diffusion laterally. At a certain point, the thing collapses. Next pulse of fluids comes through, mineralizes everything, and in the voids at the top and within the breccia column, you get deposition of your sulfides. So there's another side to this equation, though. The carbonate that's dissolved is not destroyed. It's now in the ore fluid that used to be carrying the metals. And it picks up whatever spent metals are left, a little bit of lead, a little bit of zinc, a bunch of manganese, and they continue to migrate out along the plumbing system until they redeposit as what we call fugitive calcite. So it used to be over here, it got dissolved, redeposited over here. So it escaped, but not completely. And then it plugs up all the peripheral porosity and permeability. And it is violently fluorescent. So what happens is this stuff is deposited as fracture fillings and actually fills up the porosity of the limestone. So the limestone looks less porous than it was at the time of mineralization. And this is typically what you see around one of these, is hundreds of these little calcite veins, which you can get calcite veins like this in limestone, whether or not you have an ore process going on. But you hit that with shortwave UV and you go, oh, that's pretty good. When this gets intense, we call it barbecue rock, because it looks like you're ready to throw the steaks on. And this is a classic specimen from Naica of the calcite. But if you hit virtually any calcite on a sulfide matrix from one of these deposits, you'll get the same reaction. We now use this characteristic routinely in exploration. So these chimneys are zoned. You start in the top, they're massive sulfide. As you work your way down, a little bit of skarn starts to show up in the middle. So you got calc silicates coming in here. And as you work your way down, you start to see the dikes. The dikes were present here, but they were actually completely replaced by the calc silicates. So this is zoning over close to 400 meters vertically, and it keeps on going to depth. And you get, in the skarn stage, you get some interesting minerals. You get really nice garnets, grossular to andradite. Not uncommon to see a secondary calcite, including, this is probably actinolite in here. So this is late or early retrograde mineralization. Some of the garnets are very sharp and nice. They get a little more androditic. And you get fun things like Vesuvianite, quartz. District doesn't produce that much in terms of really nice calc-silicates for specimens. You do get wonderful sulfides. So this is a big knob of pyrite with highly fluorescent calcite on it. It came out of Miguel Romero's collection. That thing's about 15 centimeters high. You get weird pyrite growth. You get these weird elongate pyrite crystals, and I do. And then sometimes you get these weird worms of pyrite. Yeah, about 85% of the pictures are things of my rocks that I paid Jeff to take pictures of. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's been very successful. Another texture you see very commonly, we see very little pyrrhotite that is still pyrrhotite, but you very commonly see pyrite pseudomorphing after pyrrhotite, sometimes with this kind of hackly surface, and very commonly with this beautiful later iridescence that gives them these wonderful colors. The pyrite after pyrrhotite is a very important texture, because to go from Fe1-XS to FeS2 is a sulfidation reaction. The kinetics of that reaction are very slow. So only a deposit that sits and stews in its own juice for a long time will develop that texture. So from an exploration standpoint, when I see this texture, I start to get very excited. And you see this in places like Bingham Canyon, Santa Eulalia, Naica, Dalmagorsk, Trepcha, a number of these big CRD systems. So it's a fun and meaningful texture. It's one of the cool ways you can take your hobby and apply it to what you do for a living. This is Mexico's biggest lead mine, so galena is everywhere. It doesn't always crystallize beautifully. It is very common to see these pseudohexagonal twins in the galena. And you get some of these very strange growths. It's really hard to tell what this was before it got naturally etched. This kind of melted look to the galenas is very common here, as it is in some places like Medan and some other deposits. So it's probably late stage, out of equilibrium, and so a little bit of the galena goes back into solution. You get lots of cool things growing on the galena, beautiful pale amethysts. And it's also a big zinc mine, so very coarse, very nice black marmatitic sphalerite, very commonly showing very well-developed polysynthetic twinning. And it's the basis for all kinds of other things like calcite. Again, beautiful polysynthetic twinning. These deposits are characterized by multiple pulses of fluids. So you get wonderful associations, intergrowths, in this case, chalcopyrite on sphalerite. Actually, that's chalcopyrite on galena. You get a lot of pseudomorphs in systems like this just because of how they develop. Chalcopyrite's less common, but is increasingly important at depth, typically with this beautiful rhombohedral calcite. And you get some very attractive arsenopyrites as well. More rarely, you get stuff like bornonite. That's a thumbnail. No, you can't have it, Tama. And this is a miniature, but you might be able to paint it. Lots of quartz, typically very sharp, very limpid, very pretty groups. This was in Miguel's collection. You do get some very nice scepters. And it's very common to see quartz with just enough amphibole or clinopyroxene in it to make it praise or whatever you want to. But green quartz, very typical in skarn deposits, not uncommonly with the secondary rhombohedral calcite growth. Rarely you'll see it encased in massive palygorskite. I stopped them before they scraped all that stuff off, but you can still see the brush marks where they started to take it off. And you see that same amphibole texture, that's the same amphibole inclusions occasionally showing up in the calcite. If you hit this with a UV light, the white calcite will fluoresce and the green will not. Big, blocky rhombohedral calcite is very common, as is big, blocky calcite frosted with a little bit of manganoan calcite, and in this case, a little bit of pyrite and chlorite. Some of these things look like they're carved out of styrofoam. Showed you that a minute ago. Another example of this dissolution and regrowth. This is a calcite rhomb that clearly saw a certain amount of attack by later fluids and then regrowth of all these features, which are all parallel to the C-axis of the rhombohedral underlying calcite. Sometimes the calcites twin beautifully, in this case with a dolomite skin, and sometimes you'll get a skin of rhodochrosite on the calcites. Typically very thin. This is not like Santa Eulalia where you get the big, beautiful rhodochrosite crystals. Moving on to crowd favorite fluorite. These, I think Bob would probably call these Mayan temple fluorites, but these octahedral fluorites built up out of cubes and highly modified cubes. So you look at these things in detail and you're going to get hexoctahedrons, you're going to get trisoctahedrons, you're going to get all kinds of fun things like that. And this is one of those textures, I'll argue, is typical of carbonate replacement deposits, because you can get fluorites like this out of a half a dozen deposits around the world. that all have the same genesis. Fluorite color, it's all over the place. Obviously, we've seen purple. Green was pretty common in the late 90s and early 2000s, often as an early stage with a lighter color around it. And intergrowths of fluorite with things like sphalerite. That piece is about like this. This was in Miguel's collection. So that's with the purple. There's galena with the green. Not easy to get the saturated green. Really common to see a very pale, light green cubes, but sometimes the cubic fluorites are like this. I can remember being in Naica and looking up and seeing this tube going up into the back about 15 meters that was lined with pale green fluorites like this. And we couldn't bribe the scoop operator to take us up there. Getting inside the fluorite, you can have a lot of fun too, because here you have a dominantly cubic stage overgrowing an octahedral stage, and the octahedral stage is marked by little galena crystals all over the surface of the octahedron. And you also get things that are typically labeled boulangerite or jamesonite inside the fluorite. This is a little heart of it within the middle. Frank Cooch and I did some work on one of these, and it turns out that things like this muthanite and implectite are really what's in those wires. Also famous for twinned fluorite. These are frequently called spinel twins, which, and Bob will correct me because he's sitting there shaking his head. As I understand it, a spinel twin is a contact twin, and these are interpenetration twins. So they should not be referred to as spinel twins.
It's just that when the cubes get in high temperature water, they develop octahedral faces, and the other faces keep growing, but all the contact surface is still octahedral.
What he said.
They call it spinel twinning, and it's on octahedral.
So you can call them spinel twins. Oh, okay.
They don't have the same habit.
Really common to see in hydros in these. And there's a bunch of fluid inclusion work that's been done on these, and they've seen up to 27 different daughter minerals in a single fluid inclusion. Some of these are extremely aesthetic with color zoning. That specimen belongs to Lauren. I don't remember how she talked me out of it, but I thought you still were. Here's another example. Great big skeletal quartz crystal. The entire matrix of this thing is just a jumble of twin fluorites. The octahedra, though, are what people really love. This is one that's in my collection that Lauren couldn't talk me out of. That's almost 9 centimeters on an axis. Really lovely, almost impossible to get the color right on it, although Jeff did a pretty good job, as did Fred Wilde when he did a watercolor. This was the poster child for the Springfield show the year I was the featured fool. And then when you start looking around, you see some other fun things like beautiful little specular hematite roses on quartz. It's known for some pretty nice fluoropophilites. And even rarer than that are things like stilbite. And you get some very attractive barytes, very commonly with tiny pyrite inclusions in them. And sometimes those pyrite inclusions show beautiful alignment in the corners of the barytes. Quite rare is celestine. This probably is indicating some involvement of basin brines in the system, but we're now recognizing that when you replace limestone, the strontium that's in the limestone doesn't have anywhere to go in the fugitive calcite, so it comes back down as either celestine or strontianite. So some really interesting work is coming out of the oil patch on that, that we're starting to apply to some of these deposits in Mexico. Continuing with the sulfates, until Balmat came along a couple of years ago with those spectacular crystals, Naica was probably the world's best anhydrite locality, these beautiful sky blue, frosted looking crystal groups. Many of them, unfortunately, leached out of calcite. They're more attractive when the calcite is still on them, I think, and some of them show beautiful twinning, like you can see right there. And occasionally, big groups of big rhombohedral calcites with big fans of anhydrite. This is now in the New Mexico Tech Museum. A lot of weird things go on when you're in the neighborhood of 55 degrees C and you're looking at anhydrite and its solubility, because it starts to be very soluble it stops being stable at 55 degrees. So quite common to see things like calcite pseudomorphs, epimorphs, casts, whatever you want to call them, after anhydrite. But this is still going on during the time of mineralization, because you're getting pyrite deposited on these, and occasionally things like fluoropophyllite deposited on them. Naica is unquestionably most famous for its gypsum. And this was, to my mind, one of the world's finest gypsum specimens. That thing was this big across, and as you can see, very aesthetically displayed on AstroTurf. But this thing was absolutely limpid until somebody tried to clean it who didn't know what they were doing. But this was in the mine office for easily 40 years, and then there was a break-in about 15 years ago, and the piece disappeared and reappeared as a thumbnail. So in the 1990s, they did a geophysical survey and got a big anomaly and decided they were going to run a tunnel over to it because the military people wouldn't let them drill a hole from the surface. And they encountered this big breccia chimney called the Chubasco chimney that had these distinctive blocks of chocolate brown limestone with these beautiful sharp gypsum, some of them the size of footballs. The only thing that body ever produced was the specimens, because there was no mineralization there. So they drove 1.5 kilometers of heading to get to it, provided us some very nice mineral specimens, and then closed it all off. But the beauty is, these are natural. And here's another example, this typical iron oxide rich matrix. And very rarely, from an area right below the Cave of the Swords, there was dendritic native copper that got enclosed in these gypsum specimens. That thing is about this tall. It's perfectly terminated on one side. That's a cleavage face. So the Cave of the Swords is right above it. Cave of the Swords was discovered in 1910. It was a phenomenon worldwide, published. This is Bill Foshag, who was at the Smithsonian back in the 20s and 30s. This is reputed by Bill Pansner, so a highly reputable source. This is supposed to be Pancho Villa. But these are contemporary photographs. A large number of these crystals, again, Foshag and Pancho Villa, a lot of these crystals were harvested and sent to Harvard and all kinds of museums all over the world. You go in the cave now and you can see the stumps where they used the handsaws to cut the crystals off. But a large number of crystals still survive. This cave has been pretty well protected since the early 70s. You see a huge number of gypsum specimens on the market labeled Cave of the Swords. They didn't come from the Cave of the Swords. They came from the Xochitl Cave, or one of several other caves in this part of the mine that were encountered routinely in the process of mining, or were in the middle of the ore bodies, and they just collected them. You used to be able to go to the mine office, knock on the door, and the mine manager would come out, open a cabinet with these shelves lined with sawdust and these gypsum crystals up to about like this. $1 a piece, take as many as you want. And it went to support the Miners' Recreation Fund. Liquid refreshment, I'm sure. But one of the realities of having that much hot water and as much calcium sulfate as there is in the system means you get a lot of gypsum that formed in that system as a post-mining or intra-mining product. And here's an example of a nice plastic rope with a beautiful little cluster of, in this case, iron oxide, oxidized iron inclusions. When you don't have the rope, these things are commonly sold as natural. And yes, they did grow naturally, but these things are coming out of sumps in the mine. The miners would throw trash of one kind or another into the sumps, and in 3 to 5 months, they would grow these crystal groups like this. They'd fish them out and then sell them. And here's another way you can tell that these things absolutely are not ancient. This is a valve from the pumping system. Most of the time, it just forms concentric layers of gypsum that plugs up the pump lines. And if you remember your geometry from high school, when you reduce the radius or diameter of a circle, what you do to the surface area and the volume is very radical very quickly. So it doesn't take much of a rind to reduce the efficiency of that, but to have a beautiful spray of crystals like that doesn't happen very often. So you see these specimens like this. This came out of a sump. You see specimens like this. This came out of a sump. So you have, depending on your feelings of whether there's human intervention or not, this is just hot sulfate-laden water that sits and cools off and crystallizes because it can, and it can't do anything else. So in 2000, I was leading a field trip of geologists from Australia and Mexico down to Naica, and I had seen some crystals about this big for sale in Santa Eulalia about 6 months before. So I casually mentioned to my friend, the mine geologist who was taking us on the tour, said, "I think you found a new cave. I've heard about that." And he looked at me and he said, "How did you know?" And then he shook his head and said, "Okay, I know who I'm talking to." "Yes, of course you know." He said, "But we only found this cave 2 weeks ago. Let me see if I can get permission to take you in there." So we go under, he comes back, says, "Yes, I have permission." We go underground. We go down to the 295 level, and here's this hole in the wall that we crawled through, and it was 125 degrees C, 125 degrees Fahrenheit, 100% plus humidity. You couldn't see you couldn't take a picture of anything because your camera fogged up instantly, and it actually destroyed my camera. But those were the crystals from the Cave of the Crystals. That's Roberto Villasuso, the chief mine geologist, who was involved for many years with the researchers on this cave. And these are some of the pictures that were ultimately taken. The longest crystals in here are between, I think the longest, this is the longest, it's 14 meters long. And I could not wrap my arms around them if I wanted to. These things are absolutely massive. People made up story. The first photographer who went in there took a bunch of good pictures, published them in the New York Times. They weren't dramatic enough, so he made up a story about some guy being in there trying to collect them and getting parboiled and dying, and which wasn't true. It actually got a Darwin Award because they didn't do their fact checking, but it got him declared persona non grata forever. He was never allowed back in the mine, and he could have had the photographic opportunity of a lifetime. So later, I mean, when we first went in, we just went in regular clothes. They later decided that you should go in with chill suits. Sometimes they use them now, sometimes they don't. Early days, you put on these little soft rubber boots and you could walk around on the crystals. They try to minimize that now, but there's a certain amount of wear and tear on these crystals after 25 years of various kinds of expeditions in there, but just incredibly dramatic. And if people have patience, I have a little video on the cave that I can run afterwards. Some of the crystals are, the first cave they found actually was what they call the Eye of the Queen, and it was marked by crystals like this, these kind of blocky crystals as opposed to the big beams, which is what they call the great big crystals. And people worry about getting them out of the mine. Well, this is great. You start doing a calculation on what one of those crystals weighs, and then you recognize that the spiral ramp to get into the mine has a tighter radius than the length of the crystal, so you could not physically get them out of the mine. If you could pick it up, you couldn't get it out. You're not picking these things up, throwing it in your day pack, and getting out of the mine. What they did find was, after about 4 or 5 years of having contact with the external atmosphere, the crystals started to show a certain amount of deterioration. So at that point, they chose to seal the cave off better, and actually most of this regrew. So the crystals healed themselves. Probably that didn't get rehealed, but this kind of fuzzy edges on the crystals did. So here's a little cross-section through the area. This is all related to the post-mineral Naica fault. And so they first came in here, found the Eye of the Queen, diverted the heading that they were making until they hit the Cave of the Crystals, diverted again, and kept on going. And then as they continued to descend, they hit the Cave of the Sails further down. And that's what the sails look like. So this was described as a new, previously unidentified speleothem. That one's not. Anyway, this thing, in addition to kicking off some really amazing photography, there were some guys in from Mexico City who were brought in. They built a robot to be in the cave with this big arm with the cameras on it that moved around, and it would run 24 hours a day, and the cameras would slide back and forth on the beam as the thing rotated slowly. The idea was to get enough pictures to be able to build a three-dimensional digital image of the cave. And they've got all the footage, but they've never been able to get the money to do all of that work. But of course, researchers from all over, especially Spain and Italy for some reason, got involved. I think probably the Spanish guys because of the cave in Spain that's kind of similar, although a lot smaller. But we now have a lot of information on it. So they've gone in, they've done uranium, thorium age dating on the Cave of the Swords. It's 57,000 years old. So it's yesterday. And 47 degrees C is the temperature of the fluid inclusions based on oxygen and carbon isotopes. It's a combination of deep groundwater and meteoric water from the surface. Cave of the Crystals is 191,000 years old, so call it 200,000 years. That's, well, if this is yesterday, that's 2 o'clock in the morning, and this is 8 o'clock in the morning. Higher temperature, 54.5, and that plays into the model for how these crystals got so big. Again, this one is deep groundwater. It doesn't have the meteoric influence. So sulfur isotopes show that the Cretaceous evaporites, the anhydrite of what's called the Cuchillo Formation at depth is the primary source of this. When you drill deep holes, you get big, thick sections of that. And there were some papers at one point suggesting that there was a biological component, a biomineralization component, but that's now been pretty well disproved. So just to give you a cross-section through the mine, so here's the Cave of the Swords up here, about 190 meters below the surface, 290 meters down to the Cave of the Crystals. So this is in the Montaña Fault. This is in the Naica Fault, and then this is at the time with the massive pumping they were doing. This is the position of the cone of depression around the mine that they're using to keep the ability to keep mining. So the model is you have hot regionally circulating groundwaters coming in at depth, flowing through that evaporite, dissolving it, and then as it comes back up and the temperature drops below about 55 degrees C, that dissolved calcium sulfate starts to deposit as gypsum. There's also part of the model is that a lot of it deposits first as anhydrite, those nice blue crystals, and then those get dissolved and reprecipitated as well. And it's a fluctuating temperature and stability between anhydrite and gypsum and going back and forth between those two, which is what the model is that lets those giant beam crystals grow in the Cave of the Crystals.
15 when they shut the pumps off. How far up did the water rebound?
I'll show you that in a minute. So how fast, I mean, everybody wants to know how fast did these crystals grow? So you take one of these large crystals, not the biggest ones, a large one, 1 by 1 meter by 10 meters long. That's 10 cubic meters. So that's, 23 and a half, almost 24 metric tons. You're not carrying that out on your back. So the first thing they did was some in situ experiments where they put basically a funnel, caught some of the water dripping in the mine, ran it through a tank with some gypsum tablets in it, and then measured them over the space of a year to see how fast they grew. And what they came up with was 3.5 million cubic centimeters over 200,000 years to make the cave. So growing at a rate of between 0.4 and 1.7 millimeters per thousand years. That's pretty slow. It's also too slow to get you the cave. So something else has to be going on. There has to be recharge, which logic and the fact that you can grow big crystals almost overnight tells you, okay, this is more likely a model that will make sense. So you start doing that calculation, and you can grow one of these crystals, a crystal 1 by 1 centimeter, 50 centimeters long in 1 year. So you do that, that gets you closer. The insights you got you a third of the way, and that's still only for a crystal that's half the size of the biggest crystal. This, with the replenishing, will get you to where you actually want to be. So just to put it into perspective, and I'm showing my age here, but your hair grows at the rate of 15 centimeters a year, roughly. That's the average. So these things are growing faster than your hair and way faster than your fingernails. So the big crystals grew at least 3.5 times faster. They had to grow. And Roberto said, working with all these scientists, he got the feeling that these things probably grew in a month, that they grow incredibly quickly. Now, depending on who you listen to in the literature, these things are described as growing either very slowly or very quickly, but it depends a lot on your frame of reference. So, what's new about Naica? So, the mine flooded in 2016, and the model that's being used now is they were way down here. They were almost 1,000 meters deeper in the mine. 200 meters deeper in the mine. They were trying to get to a new ore body that's out over here, a great big thing. And they tried to cross-cut through the Naica Fault. The problem is, on the 960 level, the water was coming out of the walls at 55 degrees C. Gypsum is still soluble at 55 degrees C. Any little passageway through that fault, and those hot fluids are going to go through and they're going to dissolve any gypsum that's there. So this fault, although it's plugged up with gypsum up here, was wide open down here. And when they came in, they hit this thing and it flooded the mine to about there in a day.
Wow.
Nobody was killed. Several pieces of equipment were drowned. They spent a year and several $1 million trying to draw the water down. That didn't work. Finally, they gave up, and Naica has been sitting there ever since. Now I'm going back to GeoGeek a little bit here. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is what we call a phase diagram. They are the bane of geology students. But basically, this is just pressure on this axis, and this is temperature. We're dealing with stuff that's happening close to the Earth's surface, so you don't have to think about this. It's just temperature. And depending on the temperature, you get gypsum, basanite, or anhydrite. And what we're working with is down here in this neighborhood, right down here. So we're looking at this boundary between gypsum and anhydrite stability. And as you're going deeper, you're getting closer and closer to that magic 55-degree number. And that's what put the mine out of business. So the water has rebounded to about here. The water has never gotten closer than 150 meters to the cave. You will hear people say, the Cave of the Crystals is drowned. You can't go there anymore. There's a man taking a picture right there who was in the cave less than 2 weeks ago. So, and him too. So yes, the cave is still safe. They still need to pump water for the military reservation. They are trying to come in with a new ramp up high to extend out to this new ore body out to the west. What this means is they're dewatering the mine And some of these sumps that used to get harvested every 3 or 4 months have now not been harvested for 10 years. So what you're starting to see on the market is some pretty nice, big, glassy gypsum crystals. And these things, I am convinced, are actually, I had Jeff photograph one of these because you got beautiful little bits of highly angular wall rock fragments incorporated. And those aren't coming from a regular cave. So this thing is about this tall.
Very heavy.
I can pick it up. And stupid, because I shouldn't pick it up. So the other thing that's happened is the witches have now been conflated with the crystal cave, and so the witches are hanging out with the giant crystals, and they have semi-annual witch celebrations in Naica, which draws a huge number of tourists and now is effectively the only economic basis for the town of Naica. So with that, I will say, you all, or most of you know, I'm in charge of exhibits with daughter Lauren, who's taking over the mantle. Next year, our theme will be mineral art and the art of minerals. So people like Tama will be featured, as will artists, sculptors, mosaic artists, and really cool rocks. So tell your friends, be sure to come. And with that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to answer a question. And if you can tolerate a few more minutes, we can run a video of the Cave of the Crystals.
Video.
Yes, Bob. That's true. The big ones are twins. They're kind of swallow-tailed twins. And it's that angle. It's actually the low energy that's produced by that advancing twin front, which is what lets them grow so quickly and selectively in that direction. And then when you start looking around at things like the Cave of the Crystals at Santa Eulalia, the crystals that come from Laguna del Rey, the big sawtoothed crystals, the big ones from Platosa, they all show that same morphology and their terminations.